Welcome everyone to this panel on risk and resilience. I'm Eric Noël with Oxford Analytica. I'm an economist by training. You know what they say about economists. We are good with numbers, but we don't have enough personality to be accountants. There is a risk management story that is the following one. It's a risk manager, a doctor, and a lawyer, and the three of them are debating the merits of having a wife and or a mistress. So the lawyer says, you know, we should all have a mistress because the wife gets very upset. It's end up in courts, a lot of legal fees. It's good for the law firm. The doctor said, no, you should not have a mistress. Only a wife. A wife is stability. It's good for your heart rate, lower your pressure, you sleep better at night. The risk manager says, no, you don't understand, guys. You should have a wife and a mistress. It's called risk parity. You know, when your wife thinks that you're with your mistress and your mistress thinks that you're with your wife, you can stay longer at night at the office and work on your risk model. That said, at Oxford Analytica, we do a lot of global risk monitoring. We publish the Value at Political Risk Index, the Country Risk Index, and the Global Risk Monitor. I'm a generalist myself. I'm accompanied today by two excellent practitioners, one from Bolivia, who's now vice chair of the WEC for Latin America, and also the former CEO of Electrobras, who's our chair of the program committee at the World Energy Council. We're talking about extreme weather events. If you look at what's happening in the United States currently, we had yesterday around 660,000 houses in North Carolina that didn't have electricity. Over 2 million houses were affected by Hurricane Matthew. Resilience is working. Apparently, Duke Energy and Florida Power and Electricity said earlier last night that their investment in trying to make their resilience stronger is working. Houses are back with lights and supply faster than at earlier times with such hurricanes. The strength also of the network with automatic relaunch of the system is apparently working. Americans have been investing close to $32 billion in energy resiliency over the last years. It's ongoing, but $32 billion is just a fraction of the $300 billion that apparently the United States need to invest in their own resiliency. Looking at the rest of the world, we, of course, at the WEC have published an interesting report that I wish you can read if you have not done so yet. It's called Road to Resilience. It was published by the WEF earlier in September. It was a co-publication, I think, with Swiss Re and Marsh McLennan, and it's about a series of concepts on the role of resiliency and weather shocks. I will have our two expert panelists speak for about 5 minutes each about their respective experience and perspective in their own countries about weather and risk management. We will try to keep it slightly positive and humorous, so you don't think that it's only about stress and depression when we talk about risk management. After all, it's the WEC. I'm told it's the World Entertainment Council. Maybe the presidents yesterday should have known that, but maybe it was lost in translation as well. Do you want to start, José, with some examples from Brazil?
Okay, thank you. And first of all, I want to thank very much WEC for this invitation and to have the opportunity to speak, to discuss with you some problems and some solutions that you have had in Brazil in the last year. As it's known, first I will tell some words about generation and after on transmission. On generation, 75% of our supply of energy in Brazil is based on hydro power plants. In 2001 and now in 2013, 14, 15, we had a drought. So it's the hydrological condition was very bad, but not so bad that it's worst of the 85 years that you have of data related with the hydrological conditions. But in these last years, it's 2014, 2015, the reservoir were very empty, and so the operator dispatched just 80 or in some case 70% of what you call the assured energy or firm energy of each hydropower plant. What does it mean? This means a very high risk for the generators. I will give some numbers. Suppose that one generator has an assured energy of 100. First, what does it mean, assured energy? It's an amount of energy in each hydropower plant that is calculated based on a 5% risk. That means that in 95% of the time, you had condition of generate more than this level of assured energy. And in 5% of the time, you had you generate less than your assured energy. So what happened in this 2014, 2015? That the power plant just generates 70 to 80%, so less than the assured energy. Suppose that we had 70%, and if the assured energy is 100, and the price of selling is 1. So the revenue would be 100. And if they generate just 70%, they must buy 30 megawatt hour or unit of energy of the spot market. The spot market is based on the more expensive thermal power plant that was dispatched. In some cases, it's 6 times this value of the price of the energy. So if it's 6 times, if you multiply by 30, in my example, it would be 180. You see the loss that this generate power plant had. So after we had done, I think, a good solution that I will comment after. Now, going to the transmission. We had some very strong weather condition with a lot of lightning, some wind velocity bigger than the project value, and in some cases we had for instance, the Itaipu transmission. Itaipu is the second biggest power plant of the world with 14,000 megawatts of installed capacity, and its energy is transported to the load center of Brazil that is located near São Paulo. It's almost 2,000 kilometers of DC transmission lines. And these towers, some of these towers were broken by this wind velocity, and in this case, even having this fault, we don't have any interruption to the customer. So nowadays, we are working first in not having the fault, but second, that is more important, is if you have the fault, not having it transferred to an interruption to the customer. So we had now what we call the resilient index. That means if I had 100 of thoughts, in how many we don't have any interruption to the customer. If it's 100, so it's 100% of resilience. If for instance, in 3 cases I had interruption, so my index would be 97%. So I think these are 2 good examples, and after I can return what would be the solution for this generation in this critical period of hydrological levels.
Thank you very much, José. Claudia?
Yes, well, I will like to complement what Jose da Costa said. In Latin America, we have 54% of the energy generated by hydropower. So this shows us how linkage is between water and energy in this continent. In this year, 2016, we had the extremer El Niño ever. It was the biggest impact in the region. We saw shark cuts in Venezuela, and in Colombia, we had a saving campaign led by the president, so they can manage these droughts they have in the hydropowers. So we have seen the impact of extreme weather in the region, and El Niño, when it caused droughts on the north of the continent and rains in the south of the continents. And La Niña is the opposite event in both. Colombia, for example, has implemented a fee that it's on the bill. It's a fee for resilience. So this fee is used to maintain the thermal power, so they can go on when the hydropowers are affected by extreme weather. Even these mechanisms are working well. We need to build a more resilient energy system in the region and try to give more affordable energy, considering the extreme weather effects, taking in account that 54% of electricity generation is coming from hydropower. We have seen a lot of initiative of investments, and the countries are trying to diversify their matrix of energy.
Interesting. Thank you very much. There is kind of a chicken and egg equation in this, whereby you need to de-risk to have investment, and sometimes you need investment to de-risk because it's expensive to put your electricity capacity, your pipeline up to a certain level, your oil production, etc. Have you seen new investment trends whereby you think that actually there is a right mix of both private sector interest, financial institutions' involvement, and regulatory regimes that actually stimulate that de-risking investment?
Yes, I think that each part had a role in this subject. In the case I had discussed before, I had presented before, we had done in Brazil a possibility for and this was a regulatory measure. Now the generator, he can sell all of his assured energy, or to have a own hedge Or if he prefer, he can transfer this risk to the customer, the risk of this hard hydrological period. He may transfer to the customer, but in this case, he has to pay a kind of hedge to the customer. In general numbers, if the price of energy would be $100 or 50, we suppose $50 per megawatt hour, he had to hedge, and the price it's calculated, the cost of this hedge is calculated based on a lot of parameters, but in general terms it would be more or less $5 per megawatt hour. So in this case, the benefits of generating more than his assured energy goes to the customer, but on the contrary, when we have this very hard period of hard or critical hydrologic condition, the generator doesn't have any risk. One point very interesting that Claudia had mentioned, and she now is, in addition to be the chair of the Bolivian committee, she is the vice chair of the Latin America Commission, is the integration of Latin America, the system of Latin America, mainly the South American system. I will give some number very interesting. In Brazil, we had nowadays a total consumption of 500 terawatt hours. And the other country that are Spanish-spoken people, our neighbors, they had another 500 terawatt hours. And in all the country, we have a very big potential for hydroelectric power plants. And these hydroelectric power plants, they are located in different hydro basins with different periods of raining. So they are totally complementary. When you see just Brazil, when you observe just Brazil, our assured energy, we had a gain of 20%. And so it's a very big one. And if we had this, if our system in South America were integrated, so with a total demand of 1,000 terawatt hours, with a 20% win, 20% gain, it would be 200 terawatt hour. If we discount what Brazil had already gained, we had 100 terawatt hours. That is more than, for instance, is more or less what are the consumption of the most of the country of South America. So in this case, it's a measure very important to decrease, to reduce the risk of these hydrological problems. Because when you have a small amount of raining in a basin, you had a lot of in the other one, and you can transfer this energy from one part to the other one. So I think this is a very important task that you have, and a very good job to Mrs. Claudia as a chair of Latin America WEC.
Yeah, well, we have no doubts about that. The regional integration will help our countries to have more affordable energy and to mitigate the risk because of this complementary weather that you have in the south and in the north. And in the same page, or in the same sense, we have some studies from CAF and other institutions showing the complementary between wind and hydroelectric cycles. So that's another way we can mitigate the risk in hydropowers, investing in wind energy sources. And another thing we have been seeing in the region is higher insurance. We have a very good example. It's Uruguay. They have more or less 80% of their power generation comes from hydropower. So they hired an insurance with the World Bank, $450 million, and they have 39 stations where they measure the rain, and when the rain is below 60% of the generation that they need, the insurance come on and help the government to buy fuels to generate electricity. So the government budget is not exposed to this risk. That's another way we can handle these extreme event weather conditions in our region.
Yes, and the insurance market is also evolving. In the case of the World Bank, it's the World Bank creating the product. Maybe there will be a mutual at one point of power generators who will do it. Right now, there is something called the Weather Risk Management Association. It's made of 4 insurers. Endurance is there, Swiss Re, Munich Re, etc. And they offer, for example, temperature, precipitation, wind speed. They also have wave height, apparently, in terms of insurance that they can offer. And those are not single products. They are hybrid products. Like at Endurance, you can find one that is about temperature, precipitation, demand, and pricing. The 4 variables are packaged into one product, which is, for me, I think, interesting in terms of a development. That's something that we didn't have 2 or 3 years ago. But the insurance model is based also on meteorological data. I was very surprised earlier this year, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO at the UN, they say that 70 countries around the world are unable to have efficient weather forecasting systems. Most of those countries are in Africa, some in Asia, some in Latin America as well. So there will have to be a significant investment as well in terms of getting better weather data, maybe from space. There are new satellite systems now that may be able to help us. If SpaceX and Elon Musk are able to bring down the cost of satellites, maybe it will be even cheaper for some countries to get the data. But we also have a modelization issue in some countries, not in the developed world. Europe is cutting edge, North America as well. But for others, please keep in mind that some of the models are fairly new, which makes explain maybe why some of the premiums are also at that level. We've mentioned the interconnection between your grids. When I was in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand not long ago, what I saw is that actually they have bilateral agreements, but it's not a truly multilateral pool. It's one country agreeing with another in terms of exchange. So I don't know what are the limits of those. In Africa, I've seen about the same thing too. They are much more bilateral than multilateral. They are also coming with new funds. Post COP21, we have the Green Climate Fund. The World Bank has launched also the World Bank Environmental Business Plan. I think it's something like 19 or 20 billion dollars that the World Bank will also provide. Are you already seeing the side effects of COP policies in terms of having additional international multilateral financing in preparedness, because that's basically a climate change preparedness that we're talking about here?
Yes, we had some very interesting efforts in interconnecting our system. And for instance, we had completed a 500 kV line that interconnect Brazil with Uruguay that is not, nowadays in operation. With Argentina, we are studying two new binational power plants. It's called Garabi and Panambi. With Bolivia, on the Madeira River, a new power plant that would be a binational one is Guajará-Mirim, more than 2,000 megawatts. Also interconnection with the three Guianas, in this case with the finance of BID, not the World Bank, but the BID. That's we intend to connect the three Guianas and then connect the to Brazil. And so it studies also with Peru and Colombia. And so I think that in a few years we will have South America completely interconnected. And in this case, all of this case, we had the offer of this bilateral bank to give the money to the development of these interconnections. One point that I think that would be very also interesting is that distributed generation. Of course, when we had it, it will increase the risk of the cyber attacks, but to that part, and I think this we will have here in the WEC Congress one session that would be dedicated to this subject. But otherwise, we had with the distributed generation, as Claudia had said, that it would be especially in sun and wind, complementary with the hydroelectric power plants. And even if you had this mini grid, if you have a big problem in the bulk power, the recovery would be much more easier than if we don't have it. So to have these benefits of this distributed generation, one point that would be very, very interesting was the possibility of having the storage of energy. And so there are some technological ways to decrease the risk of this weather condition.
But yes, in Latin America, you can see also only bilateral agreements and not like a pool or greater systems. So we have to work on that because now all the initiatives are between countries. And the effort that has been made to create greater systems are not being successful yet. And we have seen in the region more resources just for studies and for renewables that comes with the COP21 agreement. And we are working on taking advantage and try to bring these resources to our region and try to invest in a better system reliability.
Yeah. It comes also with the technological and all of the revolution of the Internet of Things, the connectivity, the sensors. I was mentioning yes. The Americans investing so much in trying to have power lines that can self-repair themselves, that have sensors and smart meters. Schneider, for example, in the US is now showing that those smart meters are really good at trying to inform power suppliers that actually there is water in a basement, that some lines have been cut, etc. It's in real time, hopefully the cost of those smart technologies is going to continue to decrease and the rollout of them will evolve. Part of the resilience conundrum is also the water, food, energy nexus. In your countries, there is a base of 153,000 megawatts of hydropower, so hydro is again fundamental. Are you able to see some sort of cooperation between the energy sector and agriculture, for example, and mining? In the case of Bolivia, there has been some case, I presume. So maybe you can tell us if there has been some risk mitigation practices shared between those three industries, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that we have to worry about this. What the United Nations they call is the fuel in sense of that we have little amount of water, fuel, but that's mean food, energy, and water. So these three we have to have not to optimize only the energy system, but the general system. We had not only this problem related also with the biomass. You had when you had the biomass to generate electricity, for instance, the sugar cane and so on. The people worried in having less space for the agriculture. And so we had to plan everything together. We had to have to establish the condition to have first the water to drink, the water to the irrigation system to the food, and the water that we needed to energy. So it's a more complex equation because we had to optimize not only the electrical, the energy system, but the overall economic system relating to the water, food, and energy.
Well, some good moves. We have seen, for example, Bolivia now is working, like Jose said, in 3 major projects, hydroelectric to export or to be binational projects with Brazil. And in these big projects, we are seeing a lot of dialogue between the agriculture sector and the generator that it's planning the hydroelectric. So you can optimize the irrigation on the fields near to the project, and also it will help to control the disasters of overrain in the region. So the project is already being built with the participation of all the stakeholders around the project. So that it's a big change in how we used to do projects in the past and how we do projects now, where you listen to the agricultors in the first stage of your project. And in the mining sector, the control is also being done by the communities to make sure that the best practice are being applied to the manage of the water, because the contamination of the mining in the water system has been in the past very bad. So we are seeing now more activity and active movement from the population and from the citizens to be part of the project and be aware what the companies are doing and how they are doing. So we see those changes as very good.
Yeah. We had a very interesting experience that we are doing now in Brazil in 2 big reservoirs. in the north part in Amazon region is Balbina, and in the northeast is Sobradinho. And we are installed there in the reservoir with solar panels, photovoltaic panels. And we had calculated, we are installed there only 5 megawatts in each reservoir. But if we installed in 1%, just 1% of the reservoir of Balbina, and 1% of in Sobradinho, we would have, in the first case, 2,300 megawatts of energy generated. In the other case, more than 5,000 megawatts. So it's a fantastic number, and that we can use the reservoir, part of it, to not disturb the environment, to generate also photovoltaic energy using this reservoir. So it's very, very important. What I think is that we had to study each basin of the river to use it to the irrigation, transportation, to energy to use as a whole. And so each basin must be studied to optimize all of the use, to the use of water to drink, use the water to the irrigation, to the agriculture, to the food, and also to energy, and also to the transportation.
Thank you. If we go back to the very good WEC report on Road to Resilience, there is a concept that is basically in two categories. One is resistance, which is really fail-safe, and how can we be prepared in terms of materials and system and solidity and robustness. And one is much more about risk absorption, which is not being stronger, but being smarter in terms of having distributed risk and enough agility in responding to those risks. Have you seen an emergence of better best practices in terms of smarter thinking? Because it's kind of easy to say that organizations can become much smarter in absorbing risk, but in terms of execution and management, it does require a new culture. And have you witnessed organizations whereby you feel that actually it's part of the culture to do that?
Yes, I think that this is really a very interesting direction that WEC gives. You have to be robust, but you have to be more smarter. And so, what does it mean? For instance, in a bulk power transmission system or a distribution system, we have to know that in some cases you will have the fault. You have some lines that will be disconnected by the lightning, by wind, something like that. It will happen. And as it happens, what we have to do to recover it, or not to giving to the customer the interruption, as I had yet mentioned it. And so there are some technological means that are very important. And so if you had a transmission line in one direction, you have to have the other one. So if you have a problem here, the other one would transport the energy so that the customer will not have an interruption. But if this interruption occurs, you have to recover it in small time. And so we have a lot of technical measure as distributed generation, start point of energy that were very important to have this recovery in small time. So that is what we are doing in Brazil, having the possibility of occurring a fault, not transferring it to a interruption to the customers. So I think this is very important. And if it occurs, I repeat again, it must be recovered in a small amount of time.
Well, in my opinion, in Latin America, we are in a different point of start. All the major efforts of the last decade were in access to the energy. So we had very low access to energy, and all the governments has worked on that. For example, in Bolivia, it was below 50%, and now it's around 95%, 98% of access to energy. So we have been focused on access to energy, and what the next steps is working on reliable and more diversity generation systems with this regional integration and investments in other generation systems. We can diversify our matrix. And yes, I think we have also another big challenge in the region is to optimize the systems.
Yeah, and trying to be centralized and decentralized at the same time is not that easy, particularly not necessarily in your countries, but in some countries we need to remember that sometimes a state-owned energy company may own 80% or 100% of an electricity market, and patronage and corruption being part sometime of the entire process. It's for those organizations it's very difficult to go and decentralize in terms of culture. If you have a question for our panelists, please raise your hand. It's a bit difficult for us because of the light to see you, but simply raise your hand and we'll make sure that we can address your question. Please don't be shy. One issue in terms of the road to risk resilience is also investing for the long term. And in the report, we were trying to address the fact that actually pension funds and long-term investors need to be part of the game, because these are not short-term investments, they are long-term, and the risk is also long-term. So you need to have people who understand that gradually the role of that capital is essential. Have you seen an emergence of interaction with the long-term investment community?
Yes, and in this case, I think it's a very important point that you touched. We have to have a regulatory platform strong to allow this transfer of the risk in a positive way to the final customer. And so, for instance, this measure that we had done about the generation based on the hydrological risk, you can do a hedge for your own, or you can transfer it to the customers. So it will be a long-term the risk to the investors. And so I think that's very important to have a robust regulatory agenda to have these risks well calculated in a manner that the investor, the pension fund, can invest in the energy and the electrical system.
Interesting. Any questions from our participants? No? Let's move on the role of regulators, because there has to be some metrics in terms of risk. It's what do you measure in terms of the risk that you want to manage, and on that road to resiliency, I think that regulators need to be probably clearer in terms of what should be those kind of secure parameters that the entire power generation, upstream, downstream, is able to perform. Do you think that regulators will come up to speed faster than they have been, and will they talk to each other, and from countries to countries in terms of best practices? We don't have a regulator on our panel, but do you have an opinion about the role of regulators?
Yes, I think that the regulator, and I think that Claudia agrees with me, they are very, very important. And of course, a Congress like that, I think we have to have some sessions related to the regulation. Perhaps it must be a suggestion for the next one, to have some session related to the regulators, because they had a very important role in this subject. And so perhaps that may be a contribution of this section to the WEC.
So next year we won't have presidents, we'll have regulators. Yes.
Talking about it. Well, yes, I think that we have a lot of spaces where regulators in the region are talking each other, but we still not seeing movements on the regulator sides to work on the resilience aspect. And about the financing in Latin America, it's important, it's special critical because access to long-term finance is very difficult, not only by their own funds, but also international funds long-term are difficult for Latin America.
Yeah, that's true. Any more comments? No? I think what I will do is basically thank you for your very interesting comments and sharing your views. I mean, the road to resilience is not an option, it's a must for all organizations around the world, not just for the energy economy, but also for the whole economy and our citizens. Thank you very much for your consideration. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, José, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session. We will adjourn, and we'll have that break that is coming a bit sooner than 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.